How does a person answer why something happens?
When you look at the findings in different fields,
Scant is the part of life in which we live.
To attain the highest values.
Before we go to that, before we start to put a structure around all this, I want to talk about what makes a really good poker player. And I want to start with, and you will be releasing soon a blog post, which I've had the privilege of reading a draft of, which is amazing. And I'm super excited for people to get to read that. Before we go into some of those points in there, I want to touch on one that you mentioned a little bit already with your gin rummy career. You've talked about this before, this idea of cultivating a persona of crazy and that unpredictability of it. Tell me more about that. Why is that important?
Sure. So I think I can summarize it by saying the less predictable you are, the less others will try to predict you. So poker and gin rummy, as we were discussing before, are games of incomplete information, where we are holding cards in our hand that the other players don't know. So even if they are able to play a quote unquote perfect strategy, if they don't have a good sense of what the cards in my hand, they can't play well. And so I like to refer as playing well a good technical game, right? You have mathematical side, probabilities, et cetera. That is table stakes. That is just a requirement to sit down. If you're making mathematical mistakes, you're going to lose. And so the assumption is you understand the technical parts of the game as far as which hands win at showdown, what your percentages are to connect with the board if you have a drawing hand, etc. Where all of the edge or advantage takes place is both in your ability to discern what your cards your opponent is holding and your ability to tell a story about the cards that you are holding, which leads your opponent to do something that you want them to do.
Yeah.
So that skill development began for me in gin and extended into poker, that I realized there was a lot of power in understanding human psychology, being able to tell a story that got my opponents to do what I would want them to do. They would walk into traps. And at the same point that even though I was playing through a screen, right? All I can see is someone's avatar, what they type into the chat, the numbers that they bet, if they bet 450 or 456, or the timing with which they click. Do they bet quickly or do they hesitate before clicking? There's a lot of noise in this data, but at the same time, there's a person on the other side of the screen. This person has deep psychological needs. They have a varying emotional state. They have mental models, ways of looking at the world. And if I could find signal in this noise with what they were telling me, both consciously, the story they were trying to tell, the deception, and subconsciously, the things that they were revealing without even realizing it, I would be able to accumulate an edge in that I would be able to see through the screen and have a good idea of the cards they were playing.
That's amazing that you can do that without body language. So you're able to just over repetition know. Let's go into that a little bit, because were you sort of creating assumptions on how people would respond and then seeing if that reflected in the data that you can see.
Exactly. So this is a good time to introduce the concept of a range. And so most beginning poker players think that you're trying to put your opponent on a particular hand. Like, oh, I think he has a flush, or oh, I think he has ace king. These types of very exacting predictions. But
which
in
are
actuality,
your hypothesis, right?
A hypothesis, correct.
Yeah.
But in actuality, you're trying to place your opponent on a range of hands, or this is the set of possible hands that your opponent could have based on the actions that they've taken throughout the hand. And so obviously some of those hands in the range are more likely, either they occur more often. So example, unpaired hands happen more than paired hands. That type of thing, or based on the actions they've taken in the hand, certain parts of their range become less likely, right? If they play in a very strong way, lots of bets and raises, that makes complete garbage hands less likely. So you weight those less in their range. And so what I'm able to do by understanding their psychology, the way that the patterns they do, the way that they like to play certain hands, I'm able to weight their range in such a way that I have a very good idea of where I stand. And it really reduces down to, are they weak or are they strong?
Yeah.
So by developing these patterns, and your question around I'm testing assumptions, because there's a range here, if they show up with a hand that is inside of that range that I assigned to them, that actually doesn't tell me all that much. It tells me a little bit if they have a hand that I thought was really rare, that it was a low probability event. But what tells me a lot is if they show up with a hand that I didn't even think was possible for them to have. And that's the clue that my assumptions are incorrect. And so generally it means that this player is thinking differently about the game, at least at this particular moment, than I had thought. And so that's revealing this invalid assumption, casting some light on it, becomes a learning opportunity. What could I have known before the hand that would have allowed me to include this as a possibility?
And the outcome there is to get, it's a binary outcome. This person a strong hand or a weak hand. You're trying to get closer and closer to a tight conclusion around this binary outcome, right? And it's relative to your hand as well. What is that?
Yep. And so this is where it gets slightly complicated. And so there are levels to this. So not only am I trying to predict what range of hands my opponent can have, I'm trying to predict the range of hands my opponent thinks that I have. And so my actual hand is less important than my opponent's perception of my hand. And so a lot of my actions are determined by, does my opponent think that I am strong or weak? And my range, how does it compare to my opponent's range? Is it stronger or weaker? And so that in that way, I have to tell a story that is in line, that is consistent with our shared knowledge.
So this reminds me of something you've been talking about recently. I think this idea of, I think it's called game theory optimization. So like memorizing optimal plays, basically people becoming machines. And I think you see this as well in chess, where you've got some players who, that's what they do. And you've got Magnus Carlsen, who like relies on intuition. And you talked about intuition being internalized experience. So is this kind of how you would encapsulate what we've just been talking about now? Is this deliberate process of developing intuition?
There's a lot to unpack there. So first, I think let's use chess as the example that you brought up. So what you're seeing in the chess world today, and this is secondhand, I'm not a top chess player, is that a typical chess game goes, say, like 60 to 100 moves. But the first 20 moves of a high-level grandmaster chess game is essentially what you call solved, in that the correct response to the previous move is known. And so it's almost like the game starts at move 21. And where Magnus Carlsen has really distanced himself from the field of late is he has been playing positions that are believed to be losing positions. And so your goal in the end of this 20-second early game sequence is to be up 1 point, or which is the equivalent of 1 pawn. And he is playing an early sequence where the computer, which is essentially solve the game because it's a perfect information game, says that he should be down half a pawn. And so no player would ever play this position. But the advantage that he has is he's played this position so many times that from move 20 onward, he has a large advantage. And because his opponents haven't studied these quote unquote losing positions, they find themselves making mistakes. And this is a bit of what's happening in the poker world. And so there's been this progression of technological innovation, which is really forcing players to adapt. So in the early going of poker, it was very much intuitive, and you just tried things and see what worked, and you just figure things out over time. And so you have this first generation of players. I would count myself in the second generation that followed, that essentially were just very good at figuring things out on their own. And second generation, you start to have more sharing of information. So high ticket courses, ebooks, coaching becomes prominent. And so there's a lot more of this taking of information away that others have discovered. And by triangulating this, you start to converge on best practices. And so everyone's style starts to become a little bit more equivalent. There's less making very obvious mistakes. And the third generation of this is you have statistical tools, where you're able to import hands into a database and discover both how players play on average. So you can craft your style according against that, but you can also see on this flop, in this situation, players have top pair or better X percentage of the time. And so the game became much more about who has done more study, either statistical or modeling situations. And in this most recent generation, which I think of as the game theory optimal approach, you have the game tree being solved, where you input a situation into a computer and it tells you what the game theory optimal or most correct approach is. And so more and more, what you're seeing is that the top players, or even players at the mid levels, are playing a theoretically unexploitable or perfect style that they cannot be beat. They're not necessarily making the most, but the style is unbeatable. And so it's really changed the game, because obviously there's less advantage to be had if people are making less mistakes. But the piece that you referred to, Play to Win, the meta skills of high stakes poker, is an exploration of I am a bit of a dinosaur in poker terms. I've never used any of these game theory tools that I know a lot of my younger peers spend hours per day literally memorizing the solutions from these tools. And what I believe is that these tools have become a crutch for these players. And similarly to what we've seen with Magnus Carlsen in the chess world, these players are extremely comfortable in these situations that come up very often that they've studied. But this becomes a crutch for them, and they lose the ability to think critically. They have no intuition and become very uncomfortable outside of these spots, which I call very central. So that's how I believe I'm able to maintain an advantage over these players. Is over the years, I've seen so many of these long tail events, which don't occur very often, but I have more experience. I've actually studied them more. Yeah. But where it gets really interesting is I'm in control of the frequency of these long tail events. And so something that doesn't occur very often in the wild, I can play in such a way that I have home field advantage more often. And so that, I think that Magnus Carlsen example is a good one, in that losing plays, or at least what can look like a losing play, becomes a winning play.
Yeah, you've talked about it as being a defensive strategy, and you've called it the illusion of knowledge as well. This idea of kind of like being the best technical player versus actually just winning the next hand or the next tournament.